This really is the language of Harvard too, isn't it? However, the government has not seen any peer-reviewed epidemiological research data on this population to support these claims, and it would therefore be premature to comment on this matter. I'll take the letter off and relieve you of it at once. Official government letters sometimes include things which their authors must later regret. See, I like that bit about the peer-reviewed epidemiological research data. No, the British government hasn't seen any and still hasn't. And it won't, because, for example, one requested survey by the World Health Organization never took place. So comment is premature, and will continue to be, though not, of course, for the children you've just seen. Now here a quotation from a classified British government report on the use of DU in the Gulf War. Radioactive hazards from the use of DU munitions, it says, and I quote, can become a long-term problem if not dealt with in peacetime and are a risk to both the military and the civilian population. It would be unwise for people to stay close to large quantities of DU for long periods, and this would obviously be of concern to the local population if they collect this heavy metal and keep it. Inhalation of airborne DU dust particles can lead to unacceptable body burdens. I love that one. DU can also be a danger if it is taken into the body by ingestion or through a cut. If DU gets into the food chain or water, this will create potential health problems. NATO, by the way, used 31,000 DU rounds in Kosovo alone. Again, the whole issue of DU has been effectively deleted from our narrative of the 1991 Gulf War, as surely as it is to be expunged from any discussion today of the munitions we're going to use on Iraq again. In Afghanistan, the so-called bunker buster bombs, we love these bunker buster things, can penetrate caves, as we know. The US military told me on the record that depleted uranium was not used. 2 British scientists suspect uranium was used, although they still have to prove this. As usual, and more than ever, we are prevented from knowing the truth. So I'm bringing the past into the present, rather than just saying, what do we do now? But I want to give you now a more personal reflection on the whole business of war on terror in Afghanistan and indeed Iraq. On December the 8th, 2001, I was attacked by a crowd of Afghan refugees in a village called Kila Abdullah, not far from the Pakistan-Afghan border. My car had broken down, and the Afghans, many of whom had lost relatives in the recent US bombing raids around Kandahar, decided to take their rage out on me. I was beaten on the head with stones, kicked out and cut. Rescue came from a religious man. I recall he had a turban, but I had so much blood in my eyes because they'd smashed my glasses, I could scarcely see him. He escorted me to a Pakistani police van. Sitting in the Red Cross ambulance on its way to Quetta, I realized how carefully I was going to have to handle the frightening and very painful event that had just occurred, and which I knew would be reported by my fellow journalists. I did not wish to be the source of another Muslim-bashing story, the lone Briton savagely assaulted by an angry mob of Afghans. We've been savagely assaulted by them since 1842, and they've always won, by the way. It's not a tradition I wish to join. I hate the what and where stories that leave out the why. Some context had to be given to their fury, their anger, some reference to the fact that they had been most cruelly bereaved, that my sudden and very definitely Western appearance in the village represented for them the face of those who had just destroyed their loved ones. So in every interview I gave, I therefore made this point. Indeed, I said and later wrote in The Independent that if I was one of those grief-filled Afghan men, I too would have attacked Robert Fisk. Those who beat me, I wrote, were truly innocent of any crime except being the victims of the world. Almost every published and televised report mentioned the reasons behind the assault, except for the British Mail on Sunday newspaper, right-wing of course, which used AP's story, but specifically deleted the one paragraph which explained why I had been beaten. Readers might have been excused for thinking the Afghans are always angry, primitive, generically violent, and thus prone to beat up foreigners and bob on a whim, the classic Islamophobic story, and the response of anyone reading the Daily Mail. Later reactions were even more interesting. Among a mass of letters that arrived from readers of The Independent, almost all of them expressing their horror at what had happened, came a few Christmas cards, all but one of them unsigned, expressing the writer's disappointment that the Afghans hadn't finished the job. Here's a Christmas card. The 12 days of Christmas. On the first day, right? Robert Fisk, spelt wrongly. A.K.A. Lord Haw-Haw. This, of course, was the Irish and British broadcaster for the Nazis in the Second World War. A.K.A. Lord Haw-Haw of the Middle East and a leading anti-Semite and pro-fascist Islamophile propagandist. Here's hoping 2002 finds you deep in Gehenna, hell. Osama Bin Laden on your right, Mullah Omar on your left. Yours, Ismail Zetin. We made it through 2002 anyway, so... But you see, the Wall Street Journal also carried an interesting article which said more or less the same thing under the subhead, "A self-loathing multiculturalist gets his due." In it, Mark Stein wrote of my reaction that you would have to have a heart of stone not to weep with laughter. The Fisk doctrine, he went on, taken to its logical conclusion, I'm quoting him, absolves of responsibility not only the perpetrators of September the 11th, but also Taliban supporters who attacked several of Mr. Fisk's fellow journalists in Afghanistan, all of whom, alas, died before being able to file a final column explaining why their murderers are blameless. Now, quite apart from the fact that most of my journalist colleagues who died in Afghanistan were killed by thieves who had taken advantage of the Taliban's defeat, Stein's article was interesting for two reasons. It insinuated that in some way I approved of the crimes against humanity of September the 11th, or at the least would absolve the mass murderers. More importantly, Stein's article would not have been written had I not explained the context of the assault that was made on me, tiny though it was in the scale of suffering visited upon Afghanistan. Had I merely reported an attack by a mob, the story, like the one in the Mail on Sunday, would have fitted perfectly into the general American media presentation of the Afghan war. No reference to civilian deaths from US B-52 bombers, no suggestion that the widespread casualties caused in the American raids would turn Afghans to fury against the West. We were, after all, supposed to be liberating these people, were we not? Remember this in a month or two's time in another country. We weren't supposed to be killing their families. Of course, my crime, and the Journal, by the way, gave its column the headline, "Hate Me Crimes," my crime was to report the why as well as the where and what. I was crossing the Atlantic on September the 11th, 2001. My plane took off from Europe just after the first reports of the first aircraft hitting the first tower of the World Trade Center. And the plane turned round off the coast of Ireland when the United States closed its airspace. So I filed my first column to The Independent from my airline seat on the plane's satellite phone, without notes, dictating with punctuation to a copy taker in Manchester, pointing out that there would be an attempt in the coming days to avoid asking the why questions. This is my story for the morning of September 12th. I wrote about the history of deceit and lies in the Middle East, the growing Arab anger at the deaths of thousands of Iraqi children under UN sanctions, and the continued occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by Israel. I suggested bin Laden may have been responsible. I wrote that thousands of Muslims may soon die in Afghanistan or elsewhere as a result of the outrages in New York and Washington. Emails poured into The Independent, mostly in support of my article, but many demanding my resignation. The attacks on America were caused, quote, by hate itself of precisely the obsessive and dehumanizing kind that Fisk and bin Laden have been spreading. According to the same message from Professor Judea Pearl of UCLA, by the way, I should add that after I was badly hurt, the two people who most closely looked after me back in Islamabad were Daniel Pearl and his young wife, Mariana. I remember saying to him there, "Are you going to Afghanistan?" He said, "No, my wife is pregnant. I've got to stay safe." In any event, sadly, Judea Pearl, who wrote this before that terrible and vicious killing of Daniel, is Daniel's father. And he went on and said, "I am drooling venom and I am a professional hate peddler." Another missive, signed Ellen Popper, announced that I was in cahoots with the arch-terrorist bin Laden. Mark Guan labelled me a total nutcase. Some of my colleagues might agree with that. I was psychotic, according to Lillian Barry Weiss. Brandon Heller of San Diego informed me that you are actually supporting evil itself. The article was only 750 words, ladies and gentlemen. On an Irish radio show in Ireland, a Harvard professor, whom I shall not name, it was Alan Dershowitz, of course, and announced that I was a liar, a dangerous man, and that anti-Americanism, of which I was obviously guilty, was the same as anti-Semitism. I have to say the show's Irish presenter eventually pulled the plug on my favourite professor, but I got the point. Not only was it wicked to suggest that someone, in however perverted a way, might have felt they had a reason, or came from an area that had a reason, to see this mass slaughter. It was even more appalling to suggest what these reasons might be. To criticise the United States, or to be anti-American, whatever that is, was to be a Jew-hater, a racist, a Nazi. Merely to suggest that Washington's policies in the Middle East, its unconditional support for Israel, its support for Arab dictators, who do what we want, of course, its approval of UN sanctions that have cost the lives of so many Iraqi children, might lie in, again, however perverted a way, or be part of the context of the venomous attacks of September the 11th. To do that was an act of evil in itself. Oddly, the fact that the mass murderers of September the 11th were all Arabs, and that most came from Saudi Arabia, was not regarded as a problem by reporters or readers, or by the US government. They were clearly from the Muslim world, quote unquote. This fell into the where and what slot. And Arab terrorists are familiar characters for many years from Hollywood. The sin was to connect the Arabs who did these appalling crimes with the lands they came from, to ask the why question. They came from the Middle East. Something wrong in the Middle East, maybe? Is there a problem out there in the Middle East? You know, when the cops turn up, when the police turn up at the scene of a crime in Boston, let's say in New York. If the cops turn up to the scene of a crime in New York, the first thing they do is look for a motive. But when the crime scene is on a vast and terrifying scale in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania, the one thing we are not allowed to do is look for a motive. How very odd. The killers were evil. They hated democracy, even though they wouldn't have known what democracy was if it got into bed with them. Now, I say all this because I do have a particular interest in Osama Bin Laden. Back in 1997, I met him, and not for the first time. I'd interviewed him in Sudan in 1994, then in Afghanistan in 1996, then again in Afghanistan, in one of his camps the following year. That last night when we met, I was driven by one of his armed followers hundreds of miles across the mountains of Afghanistan, high up the rugged, towering Kabul Gorge. The clouds were below us, waterfalls of ice clinging to the rock above our Toyota. At one point, the gunman sitting beside me informed me, Toyota is good for holy war. Not, I imagine, a slogan that the Toyota company will be using. Bin Laden, however, does not make jokes. After hours of sliding and slipping on the scree, the rough stones above sheer precipices, we reached a plateau of stones and an air raid shelter 25 feet high and 25 feet wide, cut into the living rock of the mountainside by Bin Laden's construction teams at the height of the war between the Afghans and the Russians, a war, of course, in which Bin Laden fought with great courage, wounded 6 times, on our side. These were the camps, and this was one of the camps I was sitting in very shortly afterwards, which, of course, were bombed in the Tora Bora complex in 2001, and were bombed, of course, with great accuracy. Not, I suspect, because they were smart bombs, but because, of course, the camps were built by the Americans, by the CIA, though nobody told us that at the time. Didn't need radar pictures for your own constructions when the maps are in the Pentagon. So that night in Afghanistan, I waited in a tent along with several of Bin Laden's armed followers. An oil lamp sputtered in the corner. Then Bin Laden himself came in, lithe as a cat, but I thought with a slight infirmity in one of his legs. I was carrying over my shoulder a school satchel, same one that they tried to drag off me later on, which I use in rough countries to carry my passport and other documents. But Bin Laden saw some Arabic language Lebanese newspapers in the bag and seized upon them, turning to study them in the corner of the tent in silence for all of 20 minutes. demanded an end to Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. He demanded an end to the sanctions which